Time to remaster an old classic monster ecology. 50 years ago, a man sat down to design a fantasy monster and thought, what if it was a box? A 10-foot, transparent, acid-filled box. And somehow, it became one of the most beloved creatures in the history of gaming. It's appeared in every core monster manual for every edition of the game. It's been called the greatest monster in Dungeons & Dragons by the Comics Alliance. It ranked in the top 10 most memorable monsters according to some, while at the same time, Cracked called it one of the most idiotic monsters of all time. And they're all correct. So today, we're going all the way back to 1974, following its slime trail through every edition, delving deep into its ecology, its gods, even some famously named individuals, and its impact outside of the game on pop culture. By the end of this video, you will have the answer to the question of how a large cube of jelly becomes iconic. So settle back, grab yourself a tasty beverage. It's time to get deeply nerdy, as this is a complete guide to the gelatinous cube. Unlike the majority of monsters included in the early years of the game, the gelatinous cube is not pulled from mythology. It is 100% original creation of Gary Gygax. It first appeared by name in the original 1974 white box set Monsters and Treasure booklet, though the full statistics for the creature didn't appear until the first supplement called Greyhawk, the following year in 1975. Gary wrote in the N-World forums in 2005 that because of the large and varied ecology of the D&D dungeons and underground, it was necessary to have scavengers of all sorts. So he made up the gelatinous cube, the carrion crawler, ochre jelly, and so on. There is no particular inspiration save for nature's own amoebas, insect larvae, and imagination. Gary later elaborated on the gelatinous cube in particular. He credited the amoeba and gelatin as direct visual inspirations, and a short science fiction story from an old EC comic where some astronauts visit the planet Mars and discovered it is covered by a dormant slime they call gookum that had devoured all the life forms on the planet. And when the astronauts return to Earth, the first meal they are served has some strawberry jello for dessert. So the cube's genesis began with some good old 1950s spaceman spiff, science fiction, pulp comics, but the idea stuck with Gary. And when it came to make a dungeon monster, he was already thinking about the dungeon ecology. He reasoned that if dungeons are lived-in environments, places where monsters eat, fight, and die, then something has to clean them up. Bodies pile up. Adventurers leave corpses. Without a scavenger, dungeons become implausibly tidy or implausibly putrid. So the gelatinous cube is part of the janitorial dungeon maintenance system. It sweeps corridors clean of organic matter, alongside the ochre jelly, which is a specialist in getting into all the hard-to-reach nooks and crannies, and the carrion crawler, which takes care of stuff that has a little bit of life left in it. Other oozes could also clean up different things with the particular blend of acid they contained, but the most of the exotic oozes are just that. They come from other worlds and other dimensions, making them weird and unpredictable. But we'll get to those later, they deserve their own moment. Gary also wrote in 2006 that he thought of these creatures as accidental creations, spawned by careless wizard alchemists who dumped their failed magical and alchemical experiments into cesspits and drain holes, which then affected the local single-celled organisms and gave rise to jelly, slimes, and puddings. But here's the thing. When I think about alchemically spawned mutant microbes of enormous size, it would never occur to me that one would be shaped like a cube. Nature doesn't like right angles overly much, so no, I would think of something like the other oozes, perhaps a violently unstable nightmare like the Gibbering Mouther, not a great big block of jello, and yet a cube, a perfect geometric platonic solid. Gary Gygax looked at the dungeon map and made the grid into a monster. When you look at the early dungeon maps, the scale of one square equals a 10-foot space, and the gelatinous cube is precisely 10 feet per side. It perfectly fits a 10-foot wide corridor, wall to wall, floor to ceiling. There's no gaps, and you'll never see it coming. And that design works, trust me, I know from experience. It was only in the last year or so when I finally got to cross this iconic moment of my D&D bucket list, when in a game session hosted by Esper the Bard, my mighty ogre character performed a fairly unnecessary feat of athletic strength by leaping to the top of a short flight of stone steps and landed directly on, or rather I should say in, a lurking gelatinous cube he had failed to see was there. Was I upset about this? Absolutely not. I was thrilled. This was a fantastic way to die. One of the all-time classic dungeon traps, and I fell for it completely. As luck would have it, my ogre Bogadan did manage to get rescued with some layers of skin left on his sizzling body. But I knew, years from now, a lot of things might fade from my memory. That moment never will. So what exactly is a gelatinous cube? The short answer is a 10-foot cube of transparent, mindless, acidic, semi-solid jelly that roams dungeon corridors, eating everything organic it encounters. The long answer is considerably more interesting. Let's start with what it looks like, which is essentially nothing. The gelatinous cube is completely transparent. In low light, torchlight, in a dark corridor, it is effectively invisible. The only things that give it away are a faint surface glint if the light catches it at exactly the right angle, and if it's been feeding well, the objects suspended inside its body. Coins, bones, weapons, the odd boot. Everything inorganic that it has absorbed but cannot digest, just floating there in the middle of the corridor. If you're experienced enough to know what you're looking at, that floating boot is a warning. If you're not, well, that's how you end up like Bogadan. This is genuinely elegant monster design. The gelatinous cube tells you it's there, but only if you're paying attention. It rewards players who look carefully at the dungeon rather than charging through it. For a creature with zero intelligence, it teaches one of the game's most important lessons. It punishes haste. The standard cube is, as we've established, 10 feet on every side. Some lore mentions larger individuals exist, though they're rare. In terms of weight, the 3rd edition puts it at 10,000 pounds, and the 3.5 revision bumped it to 15,000. This is, like many creatures' weights in those editions, far lighter than physics would suggest, as a cube that size made of water would top 60,000 pounds. Whatever this monstrous, murderous jelly actually is, it's surprisingly lightweight for its volume, which perhaps explains how it moves at all. Because it does move, slowly, oh so slowly, but it moves. In the original rules, it had a movement rate of 60 feet per turn, which sounds reasonable until you realize a turn in old D&D was 10 minutes. The 5th edition moves 15 feet per round. It is, in the most literal possible sense, the dungeon Roomba. It's never going to run you down when you can outpace it at a brisk walk. The danger is that you walk into it, or fall into it, or leap into it in my case. One of the cube's more remarkable physical properties is its malleability. Despite presenting as a rigid geometric solid, it can actually flow around objects and through narrow gaps, squeezing through a passage, then reforming its cubic shape once it has room again. The cube shape is essentially its resting state, maintained by the colony of microbes that compose the thing. You can tell it's a colony or swarm of microbes because the cube doesn't have any nucleus or organs of its own. Its acid is potent against organic material but does not affect inorganic matter, which is why a well-fed cube is essentially a treasure chest you've accidentally walked inside. Adventurers in later editions can actually reach into a cube to retrieve objects. This requires a DC 12 strength check and rewards you with 10 acid damage for the trouble. Entirely worth it for the right magic item. And here's where we get to the mechanics that makes the Gelatinous Cube actually lethal. Because you're absolutely right that a slow, transparent box should not be able to kill inexperienced adventurers, and yet, in the early editions, any successful hit from the cube forces a saving throw against paralysis. Fail that save, and you are completely immobilized for 2 to 8 turns, taking automatic damage from it that entire time. The cube doesn't need to outrun you, it just needs you to fail one saving throw, and then it has all the time in the world as you are being slowly digested while standing perfectly still, and your adventuring party, companions, are watching it happen. In 5th edition, the paralysis is baked into that engulf action. The cube moves into your space. You make a dexterity saving throw at disadvantage if you didn't know the cube was there. Fail, and you are engulfed, restrained, unable to breathe, taking ongoing acid damage every round. Your horrified companions can try to pull you out just like a tempting magical sword, hopefully before your face melts off. Also, remember that this creature fills a corridor. If there is no adjacent unoccupied space, you have nowhere else to escape to, which is why putting a gelatinous cube at the bottom of a 10-foot wide pit trap is so effective. There is nowhere to go but back up the way you fell down. In the original rules, the cube is immune to cold and lightning. Fire and physical weapons can hurt it. In 3rd edition onwards, being an ooze creature type brings a whole suite of additional immunities. Poison, sleep, paralysis effects, polymorph, stunning, critical hits, even flanking. The cube cannot be backstabbed as it has no back, cannot be poisoned as it has no organs, and can't be put to sleep. It doesn't have a nervous system to disrupt. Gelatinous cubes do reproduce but seem to have no young. A fully grown cube simply splits. One cube becomes 2, each a complete adult. Later lore adds the concept of budding, a small rubbery cube extruding from inside passage and left to fend for itself until it grows to full size. Little Bubba cubelings out there in the dark. Bubba cubelings are the perfect gift for friends, family, and small business owners. Just put one in a metal garbage crate for perfect organic waste disposal. I strongly advise you not to create a privy out of one though. They dissolve all kinds of junk after all. So, let's talk about how the gelatinous cube has changed, and more tellingly, how it hasn't across 50 years of Dungeons & Dragons. As I mentioned, the cube first appears by name in the 1974 white box, but its actual statistics don't arrive until Supplement 1 Greyhawk in 1975, and they are admirably simple. Armor class 8, 4 hit dice, movement of 60 feet per turn, surprise on a roll of 1 to 4 on a 6-sided die, quite high. Immune to cold and lightning. That's essentially the whole creature, one paragraph, and it works. The Advanced D&D First Edition Monster Manual in 1977 gives the cube its first proper home, alongside what would become one of its most iconic pieces of art by Dave Trampier. A semi-transparent cube drifting through a torchlit corridor, bones and treasure visible inside it. A simple illustration does exactly what good monster art should do. Tells you immediately what this thing is, what it does, and why it's dangerous. Worth noting, the stat block lists the cube as uncommon frequency, and then the very first sentence of the description calls it not uncommon in dungeons. First edition AD&D contained multitudes. The cube gets its most substantial early lore treatment in Dragon Magazine issue 124 of August 1987 in an article called The Ecology of the Gelatinous Cube, written by Ed Greenwood. Yep, the man who built the Forgotten Realms. If you can track that issue down, it's worth your time. Greenwood treats the cube with the same seriousness he'd give any other creature, and the result is the most thorough single lore treatment the monster received for decades. While Advanced D&D was doing its thing, the D&D Basic line was running alongside it as a separate product. Simpler, more accessible, aimed at newer players, yet with rules for extremely high-level play that even I struggle to understand. The cube was there for all of it. Homer's Basic in 1977, Mold Bay in 1981, Mensa's Beck-Me Rules in 1983, and the Rules Cyclopedia in 1991. The Classic D&D game in 1994. Every iteration for nearly 2 decades made room for it. The stripped-back presentation of the basic line actually suits the creature perfectly. It never needed to be complicated. Meanwhile, in Advanced D&D 2nd Edition, honestly, not much changed. The cube appears in the Monstrous Compendium Volume 1 in 1989 and the Monstrous Manual in 1993, filed under Ooze, Slime and Jelly, which is a fantastic filing system. The lore is consistent with 1st edition, no mechanical overhaul, the cube is the cube. The most notable thing about the 2nd edition cube is that it appeared on an official AD&D trading card in 1991. Somewhere out there is a Gelatinous cube trading card. That's the story of 2nd edition. In 3rd edition, things get more complicated in the way that 3rd edition made everything more complicated. The cube is now formally in Ooze, which brings the full immunity package we discussed earlier. The mechanics finally catching up with the fantasy. It gains a slam attack and the engulf action. The cube moves through your space, you make a reflex save or you're inside it, then a fortitude save or you're paralyzed for 3d6 rounds. The fortitude save DC is notoriously high, so good luck. 3rd edition lists the cube as huge-sized, which causes a minor crisis in 3.5 when it gets quietly reclassified as large, despite being the exact same creature it's always been. The weight also shifts from 10,000 to 15,000 between editions for reasons nobody ever explained. These are the kind of things that keeps edition scholars up at night. 4th edition gets a lot of criticism, some of it fair, but what it did with the Gelatinous cube is genuinely interesting. The cube becomes a level 5 elite brute with 152 hit points and high defenses. Engulf is now restricted to medium or smaller creatures, so no more engulfed ogres, unfortunately, which is a loss for everyone. But here, what 4th edition finally got right. The cube is effectively invisible until it attacks, or you make a perception check with a DC of 25. 25! That's a character specifically built around perception, with good rolls, potentially still missing it. For the first time, the cube's invisibility is treated mechanically with the seriousness the lore always claimed it deserved. The 4th edition art also makes the cube look distinctly blue raspberry flavoured, which is either a flaw or a feature depending on your preference, I suppose. The great and mighty 5th edition gave the Gelatinous cube a challenge rating of 2. The art was specifically redesigned to encourage more Dungeon Masters to actually use it, which says something interesting about how the cube has drifted from tables in the preceding editions. The mechanics are the cleanest they've ever been. The Ooze Cube trait explicitly codifies what the cube has always been in lore. It occupies its entire space. Creatures inside have total cover, but can be seen. Entering its space triggers engulf. No ambiguity. The dungeon corridor is the trap. The cube is the mechanism. The 2024 Monster Manual updates the cube alongside everything else, applying that revised stat block formatting and action economy language that runs through the whole revision. The core creature is unchanged. What matters is that, once again, as with every edition before it, the Gelatinous cube is made it into the new Monster Manual without question. Nobody sat in a design meeting and asked whether it deserved its place. Of course it did. It always does. 50 years, 6 major editions, the parallel basic line that ran for 2 decades, 1 revised edition, and across all of it, paralysis has always been that signature threat. It has appeared in the first Monster Manual of every single edition of this game without exception. In a game that has rebuilt itself from the ground up multiple times, the Gelatinous cube just keeps showing up, filling its corridor, doing its job. So, named gelatinous cubes. Well, there's only one. Think about what it means to name a gelatinous cube. It has no face, no voice, no personality, no goals beyond the slow, patient consumption of whatever happens to be in the corridor. It is, by every meaningful definition, not an individual, and yet Glabagool exists. Glabagool is the most famous gelatinous cube in the history of Dungeons & Dragons, which is a sentence I genuinely enjoy having reasons to say. Glabagool appears in Out of the Abyss, the 2015 5th edition adventure set in the Underdark. The premise of that adventure is that the demon lords of the Abyss have been dragged into the Underdark against their will, and their presence is doing catastrophic things to the creatures down there. Madness is spreading, the natural order is breaking down, and Dewey Blacks, the faceless lord, demon lord of slimes and oozes, is wandering the depths, trailing concentrated demonic slime divinity behind him like a wake. And somewhere in that wake, in a place called the Oozing Temple, a gelatinous cube absorbed enough of that ambient demonic energy to become sentient. Not intelligent in any grand sense, not capable of speech, but aware, curious, present in a way that no gelatinous cube had any right to be. Players who encounter Glabagool find a cube that responds to them, that seems interested in them, that is carrying a magical mace inside its body, in its fumbling, newly conscious way, appears to want to give it to them as a gesture of something, goodwill perhaps, which is the confused generosity of a being that has never had any thoughts before and doesn't quite know what to do with them. Glabagool can potentially join the party as a companion. It travels with them. It helps them. It is, by any reasonable measure, a person now, which means it's also in constant danger because the Underdark is not kind to anyone, and a gelatinous cube that has learned to care about things is a gelatinous cube that can now lose them. Glabagool later appears in Waterdeep, Dungeon of the Mad Mage, and gets a nod in The Wild Beyond the Witchlight, suggesting that its story continued beyond Out of the Abyss. Whether it's found what it's looking for, we don't ever entirely know. And here's why Glabagool works so well. It only works because we know what a gelatinous cube is, because we've spent decades treating them as furniture, as hazards, as jokes. The moment lands because of everything that came before it. When Glabagool looks at you with whatever it looks with and offers you that mace it's been carrying for who knows how long, it hits differently than it would for any other creature. The cube's blankness is exactly what gives that moment its power. A mindless thing became a someone, accidentally in the dark, because a demon lord wandered too close. And that's a better origin story than most player characters get. Beyond Glabagool, officially named individual gelatinous cubes are essentially non-existent in the published lore. There are cubes mentioned in Undermountain, in Hellgate's Keep, in various dungeon locations across decades of published adventures, but they're all unnamed, undifferentiated, doing their jobs in their corridors. Which is honestly exactly right. The rarity of Glabagool is what makes Glabagool matter. If every cube had a name and a personality, the moment where one achieves something like awareness would mean nothing. The vast, silent majority of cubes, patient and mindless in their corridors, are what makes the exception extraordinary. To understand where the gelatinous cube sits in the cosmic order of things, we need to talk about the gods of slime. And yes, there are multiple. This is Dungeons & Dragons. Gonadau is one of the oldest deities in the Forgotten Realms. According to Lolth herself, and she would know, Gonadau was old even before Ao's time, before the overdeity, before the framework of the cosmos as we understand it. Gonadau is rumoured to have emerged from the primordial ooze itself, which means the god of slimes may literally be as old as matter. In that ancient age, Gonadau was worshipped by the largest slimes and crawling creatures of the world, many of which possessed an alien intelligence. Oozes were not always mindless. There was something there once, something aware, something that looked up at the cosmos and chose to venerate the Elder Eye. And then Gonadar had a very bad day. The sources disagree on exactly what triggered it. Some say it was Lolth spurning his romantic interests. Others say that there was some transgression, some slight, real or imagined, and that Gonadar's response was catastrophic. In a fit of fury, he reached out to his own worshippers, the intelligent oozes and slimes that had venerated him since before memory, and he burned their minds out, struck them mad, took their intellects away. The unforeseen consequences is that many of those worshippers simply ceased to exist, because apparently a thinking ooze and a mindless ooze are different enough creatures that one cannot simply become the other and survive the transition. Gonadar lost most of his worshippers in an instant. His power collapsed. The god of slimes had, in a tantrum, devoured the very congregation that sustained him. Now here's where it gets theologically interesting. I've pondered this over a few cups of coffee. If that mythology is true, even partially true, then the mindlessness of oozes is not their natural state. It is the aftermath of a divine catastrophe so ancient it predates Drow civilization. Every gelatinous cube moving silently through its corridor, every black pudding dissolving ironwork in the dark, every ochre jelly squeezing through cracks in the stonework, all of them are potentially the descendants of creatures that once had minds, that once thought, that once chose to worship something. Of course, this is mythology. The Forgotten Realms is full of competing creation stories and unreliable divine histories. But the fact that this is the story the lore chose to tell about oozes is extraordinary. It didn't have to be this way. They could simply be mindless by nature, the product of alchemical accidents and magical contaminations, which is what Gary Gygax's own origin story for them is. Instead, the Forgotten Realms looked at these creatures and asked, what if they used to be something more? What if something terrible happened to them? Now they're just icky dungeon hazards, a tragedy really, but nobody cares except perhaps some insane ooze cultists. In practical terms, Gonadar's clerics can command or rebuke oozes as though they were undead. Let that sink in for a moment. The same divine authority that a cleric of Palor uses to turn a zombie can be wielded by a follower of Gonadar to command a gelatinous cube. Oozes occupy the same spiritual category as undead in this system, which is a fascinating piece of game theology. They are creatures outside the natural order, beyond the reach of conventional faith, responsive only to specific divine frequencies. The gelatinous cube is specifically listed among the creatures favoured by Gonadar, and occasionally acts as a manifestation of the god's presence in the world. When Gonadar wants to make a point, sometimes a gelatinous cube shows up to make it for him. And then there's Duoblex. Duoblex is the demon lord of slimes and oozes, dwelling in the slime pits, the 222nd layer of the Abyss. He's one of the most alien of the demon lords. No face, no form, just an amorphous, ever-shifting mass of malevolent ooze with no interest in anything beyond consumption. Most demon lords want power, they want worship, they want territory. Duoblex just wants to absorb things. He's a blob. Here is where it gets complicated. Some sources suggest that Duoblex is actually an aspect of Gonadar, that when mortals pray to Duoblex, it is actually Gonadar who answers. The two are so closely linked in the cosmology of slime that they may be at the same level, the same entity wearing different faces, or in Duoblex's case, wearing no face at all. What Duoblex's followers gain is the ability to summon oozes, including gelatinous cubes, and the longer someone serves as a thrall of Duoblex, the more they begin to lose their own discernible anatomy. They start to become the ooze, which is either a horrifying fate, or from a certain theological perspective, a return to something very ancient indeed. It was Duoblex's presence in the Underdark during the Out of the Abyss that gave Clabagul its sentience. The demon lord of slimes wandering the depths accidentally gifted awareness to one cube by proximity alone, which raises the question of whether Jurblex was restoring something that Gonadau destroyed, or simply creating something entirely new. The lore does not answer that question. I think that's the right call. Briefly worth mentioning, the Alkalith is a type of demon specifically tied to slimes that can command any ooze, jelly, or fungus-based monster. It represents the demonic intersect of fiend and ooze, and it is further evidence that in the D&D cosmology, slimes are not just ecological debris. They are a fundamental force with a planar weight, with divine history, with demons specifically evolved to lead them. The gelatinous cube filling its corridor in the dark is the ground level of something that goes all the way up to demon lords and ancient gods. It just doesn't know that. It doesn't know anything at all. And that's maybe the point. So, the gelatinous cube has been a fixture of Dungeons & Dragons for 50 years, but it hasn't stayed in the dungeon. It has escaped into the wider world in ways that are sometimes quite surprising, occasionally bizarre, in at least one case, genuinely useful. The cube's biggest mainstream moment came in the 2023 film Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves, and the way it arrives in the film is so perfectly D&D that it could have only been written by people who have actually sat around a table and made terrible decisions together. The party needs to escape. There is a displacer beast behind them, and someone, presumably the player character's equivalent of whoever thought this was a good idea, decides that the correct solution is to voluntarily jump into a gelatinous cube. This is not a plan that sounds good when you say it out loud. It's absolutely a plan that gets made at D&D tables. I gotta hand it to them. The film understands the game in that moment in a way that a lot of D&D adaptations haven't managed. Getting the cube onto screen was a genuine technical challenge. Todd Vaziri, the compositing supervisor at Industrial Light and Magic, noted that nobody had ever seen anything quite like it on film before, making a transparent, semi-solid moving mass look viscerally present and dangerous rather than just a wobbly special effect requiring careful work. The result is one of the better creature effects in the film. What's perhaps most telling is that Hasbro chose to announce first for the film's toy line. Not Chris Pines' character, not the dragon, not the owlbear. The first product announced for the Honor Among Thieves tie-in range, revealed at San Diego Comic-Con in 2022, was a gelatinous cube collectible figure. A 6-inch scale translucent with 14 snap-in accessories suspended inside it, including a nod to nearly 50 years of D&D history alongside weapons and items from the film itself. Hasbro made the cube the face of the merchandise before they announced a single human character. A 50-year-old blob of jelly outsold the movie's stars before the film even came out. The cube has been a reoccurring presence across decades of D&D licensed video games. Eye of the Beholder 2, Neverwinter Nights, Baldur's Gate, Dark Alliance, Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms, Warriors of Waterdeep, Sword Coast Legends, and the Dungeons & Dragons Minecraft crossover have all found room for it. It turns up in dungeon crawlers as a reliable hazard, often functioning exactly as it does on the tabletop, something you walk into before you realize it's there. Goodman Games' Dungeon Crawl Classic series, which launched in 2003 as a loving tribute to old-school dungeon crawling, had used the gelatinous cube prominently across multiple modules, including Dungeon Crawl Classics number 3, the Mysterious Tower, where it guards a key area in exactly the way Gygax originally intended. The cube appears in the Saturday Morning Adventures comic series, a tie-in to the 1980s Dungeons & Dragons animated cartoon. It has turned up in Dragon Magazine comics and various tie-in publications across the decades. Wherever D&D has put monsters on page or screen, the cube has eventually found its way there. And then there is the soap. Artisan soap makers, bless them, have produced translucent green glycerin soap bars in the shape of a perfect cube, complete with tiny suspended inclusions, skeleton pieces, coins, small items floating in the jelly, exactly as the lore describes. I have received this as a gift. I loved it. It is perhaps the most conceptually perfect piece of D&D merchandise ever created, the Gelatinous Cube, the dungeon's cleaning system, the creature whose entire existence is defined by absorbing organic matter and leaving things clean in its wake, reimagined as a bar of soap to clean things, just like the cube. Gary Gygax invented a dungeon janitor in 1974, and 50 years later, someone made it into a bathroom product. So, how does a 10-foot cube of transparent acid jelly become iconic? We've covered 50 years of editions. We've followed its slime trail from Gary Gygax's 1974 white box through every monster manual ever printed. We've looked at its biology, its theology, its one genuine moving individual, and its unexpected second life as bathroom products. So let's try to answer the question. The Gelatinous Cube could only exist in a dungeon, not in a forest, not a city, not a mountain range, a dungeon. It is shaped for dungeon corridors. It feeds on dungeon detritus. It is the dungeon's immune system, its maintenance crew, its silent custodian. No other monster in the game is so completely and specifically adapted to its environment, and that specificity is what makes it feel real. When a Gelatinous Cube appears in a corridor, it doesn't just threaten the players. Someone built this place. Things have lived and died here. The dungeon has an ecology, a history, a logic, and the cube is the proof of that. A floating coin, a suspended boot, a faint surface glint in the torchlight. The cube announces itself, but only to players who are paying attention. Slow down. Look at the dungeon. The environment is telling you something. The creature with no mind has been teaching players this lesson since 1974. Gary Gygax wrote one paragraph about this creature in 1974 and has barely needed to change since. Every edition has updated the mechanics, cleaned up the language, adjusted the numbers, but the creature itself, what it is, what it does, why it matters, arrived essentially finished 50 years ago. In a game that has rebuilt itself from the ground up multiple times, that has sparked edition wars and lost old players and found new ones, the Gelatinous Cube has just kept showing up, filling its corridor, doing its job, unchanged, unchallengeable, unquestioned in every monster manual ever printed. And then there's Glaberghoul. Everything I've just said about the cube, its mindlessness, its simplicity, its completeness, is exactly what makes Glaberghoul work. We know what a Gelatinous Cube is. We know it doesn't think, we know it doesn't feel. We've spent 50 years treating them like furniture, as hazards, as the punchline to the story about that one time someone in the party walked into a corridor and disappeared. So when one of them, just one, in one adventure, in one temple in the Underdark, absorbs enough ambient demonic divinity to become aware, the moment lands with a weight it has no right to carry. A cube of jelly becomes a someone. It has thoughts now, fumbling and new. It's been carrying a magical mace inside its body for who knows how long, and it just wants to give it to you, and it can't explain why, because it's only just learned that there is a why to have. That moment only exists because of everything that came before it, because of 50 years of Gelatinous Cubes that didn't think, that didn't feel, didn't matter as individuals. So, Gary Gygax looked at a dungeon map in 1974 and made the grid into a monster. And somewhere down there in the dark, silent and patient, it is still moving through its corridor. Watch where you step. My name is AJ Pickett, your sage of Candlekeep, the Deckard Cain of D&D, expert on the imaginary. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll be back with more for you very soon.